Good morning. Good morning to everyone participating in the Kantar Episode 3 Oncology in China. My name is Mark Booth, and I'll be leading the moderation today for this very interesting webinar where we're going to learn about the China market and really understanding the treatment differences compared to the G7 market. So today with me, I have some very special guests. And my subject matter expert panel are some really exciting folks from Kantar, which is the following folks, which is Linda Zhao, which is our Senior Director of Oncology and Specialty Therapeutics Group. Linda has been a part of the Kantar family for not more than 6 years now. Prior to that, she spent 7 years at Draco Health, where she focused specifically on the China market and understanding that particular landscape. Along with Linda today, we have Song Lee. Song Lee is our veteran of the group here with us for more than 15 years at Kantar. He's had many different roles, including forecasting, competitive intelligence, due diligence, BD&L. So really excited to have Song as a part of this initiative today. In addition to Song, we have Anna Bordeaux, who is with us now for 3.5 years, a graduate of WashU with her PhD in cell biology, and now a consultant here in the Oncology and Specialty Therapeutics Group. And then lastly, myself, I'm the moderator, Mark Booth. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Client Partner Team, focused on oncology and rare diseases. And we're here to talk to you about China, oncology in China. So today what we're going to do is we're going to focus on 5 themes. And those themes are the following. We're going to talk a little bit about understanding China and the market itself and understanding the big picture. We'll then transition to the tumor burdens in China and really understanding the epidemiology and how it's different from other parts of the world. And this information will be powered by Patient Metrics, which is a part of the Kantar offering suite. Then we'll come to our last 3 topics, which is the differences in treatment, specifically talking about targeted treatment versus novel therapy as they compare to the G7. And then we will go to China's novel agents and looking at what's been approved and the pricing differences. Once we've accomplished that, we'll transition over to differences in standard of care, which are likely a really hot topic. And then we'll open up the floor for discussions when we have lots of questions, and I'm sure we'll get into some really neat things. So without further ado, what I'd like to do is I'd like to open up this session with focusing on understanding the China marketplace and getting a snapshot of what things look like and get more educated on the marketplace. So Linda, can you provide us with a short overview about the China market and what's important to know particularly from the regulatory bodies and the insurance coverage?
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Mark, for the introduction. And thanks to everyone for attending this exciting webinar. Same as you, we are very excited about the China market. And we understand not everyone knows China as much as other people. So in the next 5 minutes, I hope I can give you a top-line overview about what China is and what China stands now before we dive into the very exciting oncology data from Kantar. So where's China? China is far east, and from way in the U.S. in the west, and sometimes we lost the sense how big China is. China geographically is about the same size of the United States. And it actually, if you look at the map on the right hand, and it is neighboring by land to 14 different countries. And namely, like Afghanistan, Russia, and North Korea, and India, and Pakistan. And beyond those land neighboring countries, and China is also neighboring to 8 other countries by the sea, namely Japan, South Korea, and Philippines, just to name a few. So China is a vast land, and with very complicated neighboring and historically, China is a self-sufficient agriculture-based country for the last 5,000 years. And only in the last half century, especially in the last 30 years, China has been on the fast track for modernization and industrialization, which happened in the West world like a century ago. So China is catching up quickly. So that sets the tone. You can see for China what kind of change has been happened in the last 30, 40 years. And that's all driving to why we are here today, because simultaneously with all the economic reform, and today China, the oncology market is set on track to also become one of the largest oncology markets, which most of our audience here today, that's why we are here. So some basic facts about China. China, number one, we have 1.4 billion people. And that's a lot, right? If you look at the United Nations, the world population today is 7.8 billion. So that's significant. We're almost over 15% of the world population. But remember, 60, 70 years ago, when the Communist Party defeated the National Party in 1949, and at that time, China had over 500 million people. And at that time, the world population is around 2.some billion. So China population is always around 15, 20% of the population, and supported by the self-sufficient agriculture. So on this slide, without reading all the details, I want to point out a couple of things relevant to the oncology market. So China is urbanizing quickly. Quickly means in the last 30 years prior, China is, like I said, more rural, agriculture-based country. And the beginning of the last century, China is 10% urban population. And then 30 years ago, like in the 1980s, it was 20% urban population, 80% rural. But today, it's 60% urban population. And the last two rows point out is the medical insurance coverage nationwide. Never happened in China before. China earlier is always some privileged urban employee has insurance, medical coverage. But now end of 2019 last year, the national coverage. And administration side, like Mark mentioned, China has a very complicated system how to regulate your drug to be approved, to be priced, to be consumed, adopted in China. So if you look at this chart, China has several major governing bodies. And the most important one to multinational is the National Medical Product Administration, equivalent of US FDA. And here you get your trial application and your drug approval and medical device approval, and also post-market surveillance. Beyond that, for multinational drugs, your pricing is decided by the National Development Reform Committee, and then the National Health Security Administration decide what drugs reimbursed and how they are paid. And lastly, this is very different too, is in China, the majority of healthcare hospitals are under the government system. So how your infrastructure, hospital develops, everything is decided by the government. So it's very different from how we view the health, the drug pricing, reimbursement in the U.S. And the last slide I want to really point out, by end of last year, China has the national coverage, like the earlier slide showing, that if you look into the detail of how much were paid for the medical services, and actually in the employee treatment payment, which population-wise only around 23%, But dollar-wise, it's over $1 trillion paid in this portion of insurance. On the residence insurance, which covers the vast majority of the population, the payout is around $0.7 trillion. So those two blue parts in the center of this slide provide the whole population, provide most of the payment for the medical services. There are a couple of other things. The catastrophic medical insurance is for the people who have severe deadly disease, and there this insurance come in, so people don't need to sell their roofs, so they can continue to live. And that is cover the catastrophic disease. And medical aid is like Medicaid in the U.S. They cover the poor, the extremely poor population. Commercial insurance is coming to play in the overall picture, but it's still population-wise, it's small fraction, but the payout actually is you cannot ignore that. So hopefully those 4 slides set the tone, give you a little bit of understanding on the China overall before we dive into the oncology market. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Linda. Thanks for that informative overview. That was a lot of information in 4 slides. And before we transition to our next theme, I just wanted to ask one quick question, and that was, what would be the one item that would be most important for our stakeholders listening today to really understand and comprehend when it comes to developing a commercial strategy in the China marketplace? So what do you think the one takeaway might be?
That's a really complicated question. I can sit here for 1 hour diving into. But one thing I would say, when you're facing the China market, get in there, just to remember, like a popular saying there, in China, like nothing, a big issue is too big. The reason is because no matter how big the issue is, with the 1.4 billion people, you divide that, it will be solvable. On the other side is, don't ignore any small issues. Like if you think, why my drug is only 0.1% utilization, later on we will cover that. 0.1%, if you times that with 1.4 billion, that's probably more than some of the country. So nothing too small is too small. Nothing too big is too big. That's my one takeaway.
Okay. Well, thank you, Linda. I certainly appreciate it. I'd like to take some time to move on to our next topic and discuss the epidemiology or really talk about the tumor burden in China. So, focusing on the tumor burden today will be Song Lee. Song, can you do us a favor and share with us today what that looks like? What do the burdens look like in China in terms of incidence and prevalence?
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you, Mark. So, as Linda just mentioned, nothing's too small in China. So I'm sure if we talk about cancer burden in China, you'll find a lot of information online, like big numbers, how many lung cancer, for example, how many lung cancer new cases will be diagnosed in China next year. So we thought we're not going to repeat that for today's presentation. We'll make it interesting. We want to take the look, examine China's cancer burden from a different angle. So when you talk about those big numbers, you have to keep in mind that China accounts for about 1/5 of world population. So everything needs to be put in that context. So what we did in this graph is that we first put the red line, 19%. That's the population share of China. Then we look at the top tumors based on global incidence and look at so whether it's below or above that red line, so that tells us whether China has quote unquote the fair share of cancer burden for that tumor. So if you look from that perspective, actually China's all cancer burden is moderately higher than global average at 21%, on a 19% population share. But then when we look at the top 8 tumors based on global incidence, pictures are very different. So 3 tumors obviously stand out, lung, gastric, and liver. So in fact, you can say almost half of the new liver cancer cases in the world are diagnosed in China alone. So obviously, China has a very heavy burden on liver cancer and the other two, gastric and lung cancer. On the other hand, prostate cancer is way below down here, way below that 19% mark. So that's not to say that there's no big unmet need in prostate cancer in China, but we just thought if we look at the cancer burden in China from this perspective, we believe that reveals some interesting information than just read those big numbers. So follow that logic. So we took a closer look, compared U.S. and China, looked at the top 10 tumors based on incidence for both male and female populations. It turns out, interesting. So, for example, on the male side, you have many tumors that made the top 10 list in both countries, but the rankings are quite different. And there are quite a few tumors you only find in one country and won't even make the top 20 in the other country. For example, melanoma in the U.S. or stomach or esophagus in China, they probably won't even make top 20 in the other country. On the female side, things are a little bit different. The top 3 tumors happen to be the same for the female population between the two countries, but below that, not many things in common. And even for the top 3 tumors, the incidence share as a percentage of the total cancer incidence in those two populations, the shares are very different between those two populations. So clearly, the epi mix is very different from for China and U.S. and actually even Japan, another East Asian country. So that's where we do the work, because all these big numbers, they probably help us understand the market, but to make business decisions, we need a lot more details. So that's what we do at Kantar. As Mark mentioned, we have a database called Cancer Impact. There's a module called Patient Metrics. We provide a lot of details on epidemiology numbers. So I have been talking about percentage, but here we see absolute patient numbers. So we put gastric cancer incidence in the chart on the left. So now you can see how big the China gastric cancer incidence compared to U.S., EU5, and Japan. And we also highlighted the stage 4 incidence in orange. So even though Japan also has a high incidence rate of gastric cancer, you can see that the stage 4 represents a much smaller share in total incidence in Japan. So just the stage 4 incidence alone is probably bigger than most of the countries' entire gastric cancer incidence. Another very important thing we want to point out is that in China, you almost always have to calculate urban and rural population separately. As Linda mentioned, the different income, different insurance coverage, and also the incident trends may be different. For example, in gastric, as Linda just mentioned, rural population accounts for about 40% of total population in China these days. But if you look at the gastric cancer incidence, rural accounts for more like 45, closer to 50%, and the trends are very different between urban and rural populations. So it's very important to calculate them separately. That we also do at Kantar, as we showed on the rightmost column in the chart on the left. Then on the right, we show a waterfall or funnel, actually, just show the level of details we provide in Cancer Impact. So we start with a concept called active disease. For those of you who are not familiar with this concept, it is the maximum treatable patient numbers. So that is different from incidence. We think this is the most relevant number we want to use when we try to estimate the market size based on patient numbers. Then start from there, we calculate patients receiving drugs, and then all the drug-treated patients by stage and line of therapy. And if there's a relevant biomarker, we also calculate patient numbers based on biomarker. Actually, there are 2 more layers below that. We also calculate patient numbers based on drug regimens and individual drug agents they receive. So those are the details that we provide to support our clients' decision making, because you cannot just look at those big cancer burden in China to make your business decisions. And the last point I want to bring up in this section is GlobalCan. So GlobalCan is such a great data source. We also use GlobalCan frequently at Kantar, but just want to point out that sometimes GlobalCan can be quite inaccurate. This was actually brought up by one of our clients. She noticed that our 2018 projection of China gastric cancer incidence was way lower than the GlobalCan 2018 projection. So we investigated and we figured out why GlobalCan missed that much. We also found a paper, recently published a paper authored by a group of leading oncology epidemiologists in China, and they projected 2020 incidence. They only projected 1 year. So they projected 2020 incidence number very close to ours. So, just want to bring that up. GlobalCan is great, but just be careful. Sometimes it can be very inaccurate. So with that, Mark, I'm going to pass back to you so we can probably discuss the next topic.
Okay. Well, thank you, Song. Certainly, that's some pretty interesting data that you shared with us. I mean, there's no doubt there's a stark contrast between the tumor burdens here in the United States versus what's going on in China. So that that slide showing the differences was quite astounding, and certainly the differences here with GlobalCan. But thank you. So for our next topic, I'd like us to shift, and we'll be talking a little bit about the differences in the utilization of both targeted therapy and expensive novel therapies, and how they really compare, and really compare to the broader G7. So, with us to talk a little bit about this is going to be Anna. So Anna, let me pass the ball over to you and take it away.
Sure. Thanks, Mark. So just to start us off, I'm going to talk about some data that we gathered in our treatment report. And a little bit of background, these are physician surveys that we field annually in U.S., Japan, and China. And in 2020, we really expanded our China coverage. So we now cover 28 consumers and 15 tier 2 cities on top of the cities we already served physicians from, and 4 tier 1 cities we served physicians from previous. Treatment practices from over 100 physicians across 28 cities in China. This is really a striking example of the differences in treatment that can be seen in the use of the and BRAF inhibitors. So if we begin to look at the chart on the left here, you can clearly see that checkpoint inhibitors are the standard of care in the G7, while in China there are very few patients that use agents. So similarly, on the right-hand side in the BRAF mutant patients, BRAF inhibitors and so to a lot of inhibitors are clear in the G7. But due to the limited availability,
excuse me, sorry to interrupt, Anna. Your voice sounds a little bit broken. I see some audience cannot hear you. Can you move a little bit closer to mic? Thank you.
Yeah. Hopefully everyone can hear me a little bit better now.
That does seem to be better. Thank you.
Better. Yeah. Thank you.
Great. Sorry about that, everybody. So I'll just recap what I said here. It was a good example of some of the major differences in the use of targeted therapies and novel agents between the G7 and China. So on the left, we have the use of immunotherapy in BRAF wild-type first-line melanoma. We can see that checkpoint inhibitors are the clear standard of care in the G7, while in China we have very limited checkpoint inhibitors.
Hey, Anna?
Yeah?
Anna, it's Mark. Sorry. I seem to be getting a lot of feedback on the line. I think a lot of folks are struggling to understand what you're saying. I'm wondering if you've got a bad connection. And I'm just going to ask that Linda jump in here for a moment and just take a stab at taking your section, just because it's really difficult to hear you. I hope you don't mind.
Yeah, I'm trying to dial back in. All right.
Okay, yeah. While Anna trying to dial back in, I will just finish what she is trying to say. Can you guys hear me clearly?
Yes, it's much clearer now. Thank you, Linda.
Okay. Yeah. What Anna is trying to illustrate here is melanoma, one of the tumor we monitor in all the global region, G7 and China. On this slide, you can clearly see the differences of the uptake adoption of immunotherapy on the chart on the left. U.S., EU, Japan in the first line in BRAF wild type is mainly dominantly treated by the immunotherapy. On the contrary, China immunotherapy utilization, even though we had the immunotherapy drug approved there, its utilization is rather low. It's still relatively a lot used in the cytotoxic agents. And if you look at on the right side in the BRAF, in the BRAF inhibitor mutation side, in the US, EU, Japan, similarly, they majority taken by the BRAF inhibitors plus immunotherapy. And in China, and the utilization, relatively speaking, is much more in the smaller percentage. But remember what I said, 20% is small, but 20% of the huge population is big. So look at it in both ways. And those were caused by quite a few different factors. One is the approval status is different. Some of the drugs are not available in China, and the pricing in China is so different. If you see pricing and reimbursement, like the one I showed earlier, China has 100% insurance coverage. However, very few of the multinational premium high-priced drugs are on the national reimbursement list. And that means patients need to pay out of pocket. And so those are all playing into the utilization differences. And the other tumor we're trying to show here is in HCC, which, like Sun said, is half of the global HCC population are in China. But if you look at the utilization of immunotherapy and TKIs, and that's also very different. In the Child-Pugh A status, which the more healthy patient, in the U.S., in the G7, is the immunotherapy TKI are entrenched, and China is around the 30%. If you look at a more patient with more poor patient performance, and the utilization of the drug systemic therapy, including chemo and immunotherapy and TKI. And of course, you see in the G7, the red bar is way higher than China. And so what is missing in China? A lot of people, patients are still being treated by the cytotoxic, the traditional drugs. Okay, so I think Anna is back. You want to take over from here, Anna?
Yep, sorry about that, everyone. Please let us know if you still can't hear me. So if we move on to a hematologic tumor, looking at the AML market, it's highly segmented by various driver mutations in the G7, especially the US. While in China, we see very little segmentation. So in the past 4 years, there have been numerous targeted agents that have been approved. And so alongside patient fitness now, the mutations are also really treatments in the G7. However, in China, there are no targeted agents that are approved for AML yet. So instead, physicians are continuing to make treatment decisions based only on patient fitness. And so we still see the use of 7+3, the CAG regimen, or hypomethylating agents, highly utilized in China across all patient segments. So instead, our starting to market.
So again, and I'm sorry to jump in here, but it sounds like you're breaking up again. So
Okay.
you must have a bad connection today. So my empathies and apologies.
Sorry guys.
No worries. So Linda, do you want to take over for Anna in this position? I believe Anna was talking about the 7+3 regimen.
Yes. Sorry, guys, it's a technical issue. This whole pandemic, everybody, sheltered, so we have to do this virtual. Hopefully next time we can do in person. But anyway, let me continue where I'm stopped. So AML actually is a tumor with striking differences between G7 and China. And not only because the China G7 traditionally the big differences, but also because AML itself has gone through dramatic change in the last 5 years, simply because Anna just mentioned the new biomarker segment introduced for this tumor, the FLT3 IDH1 to others. None of those drugs currently are being approved in China. So China is still using all the cytotoxic drugs, 7+3 tag, all the HMA agents. And Astellas recently filed approval for the new FLT3 drug. So once that comes into China, we are looking forward to the first change in AML treatment landscape in China, as we follow to like other tumor you can see. So this slide shows you the differences of how non-small cell lung cancer treatment between China and G7. This is very fresh data. We actually the survey was just done in September and October in China, and we have not published the final data yet. Very fresh data. And if you look at the first line, patient without driver mutation, but with PD-L1 high positive, 1 to 49% express level. And in U.S., EU, Japan, immunotherapy is becoming the standard of care. It's like almost 50%. In China, the utilization is catching up, but it's still in the below 10% range. And if you go to the patient population with high PD-L1 expression level, and you can see the utilization, the adoption of immunotherapy is even higher in the G7 with either monotherapy or combo. And China is following quickly, and but still, relatively speaking, on the skill side is on 20%, still not on par with the, not entrenched, put it that way. And that counts 80% of the patients are still being treated by the traditional chemotherapy. Huge potential to more uptake, but it takes time. And with all the other things have to come in play, pricing, reimbursement, and also competition of the domestic drugs, which some will touch on later. Very complicated picture there. So the other one is still also in non-small cell lung, in the driver mutation segment, EGFR drive. China does have its own EGFR drive, but if you look at the big picture here, in first line, G7 inhibitor is almost like dominant, but in China, still under 50% of the patients are being treated by targeted therapy. And I believe that's the last one in this section. Thank you, Mark. Thank you all. I can turn to the next.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much, Linda. And thanks for filling in. I know Anna's having some struggles with her technology today, and we went a little bit over on this section, so our apologies to the audience. So for this section, we'll probably go a little bit quicker, and we're going to transition now back to Song Lee and talk about the developed novel agents in China. This has been really a hot topic for a lot of folks, a lot of interesting things going on in the space, and it doesn't seem to be slowing down. So, Song, would you give us an update on what's happening in terms of distinct novel agents in China?
Sure. Well, thanks, Mark. Well, again, let's look at the first picture first. That's the growth of the China oncology drug market size. So it has been rapid, and there's no signs of slowing down. But until a few years ago, when we talk about China oncology drug market, we usually talk about, okay, what international drugs are available in China? What is the lag time between, for example, U.S. FDA approval time and Chinese authorities approval time? So what, 2 years, 3 years, or whatever. So until like 2 years ago, we noticed a new thing that there are more and more domestically developed drugs that have been approved by the Chinese authorities. So we look at the Chinese authorities' website. We identified about a dozen drugs that were, in the past 2.5 years, 2018, 2019, and first half of 2020. So those were the drugs approved in China, and for most of those, with the exception of zanubrutinib, the Beijing drug, all these drugs currently are only available in China. Some of them probably will try to make to U.S., EU, and Japan, but at this point, they are only available in China. So obviously, that makes the competitive landscape very different in those tumor types. As you can see in the right column, quite a very broad range of tumor types are covered by these domestically developed novel agents. So you may notice that one thing that stands out here is that there are quite a few PD-1 inhibitors, on the list, which is also a hot market section. So we took a closer look at checkpoint inhibitor market. So that's a timeline that shows when checkpoint inhibitor drugs were launched in China. So, well, not surprisingly, led by Nivo and Pembro, both happened around mid-year 2018. And then there were 3 domestically developed PD-1 inhibitors, that followed by PD-L1 inhibitors and another domestic PD-1 inhibitor. And interestingly, AP, even though AP was launched before any of the PD-1, PD-L1 inhibitors, it has never been approved in China. So there are no dual IO treatments in China so far. So obviously, that creates a very different competitive landscape in China when you look at the PD-1 inhibitor or checkpoint inhibitor marketplace. But what's even more striking is when you look at the prices. So we took the pricing information and did some estimation of the annual prices of the 2 first, PD-1 international PD-1 brand, PD-1 inhibitor brands, and the first 2 domestic PD-1 inhibitors. So obviously, the domestic ones are a lot cheaper. And what's more important is that sintilimab last year was involved in the national reimbursement drug list. So now it is reimbursed. That's for a 2-year period, starting from January 1st until the end of 2021. And that is the only PD-1 inhibitor drug that is covered by the NRDL. So if you look at the out-of-pocket price for patients after reimbursement, that's like 10 times cheaper than the international brands. So obviously that's going to have some huge impact on the market share. We'll show some numbers in a minute. So with all these domestic drugs, what about their utilization? So we, took 2 examples. The first is in a market, we say, there's a market with very few treatment options. That's the refractory relapsed small cell lung cancer. Traditionally in China, chemo was pretty much the only choice. And then anatinib was approved for small cell lung cancer in September last year. And we conducted our annual treatment architecture physician survey in April. That's just a few months after the approval. So as you can see, it grabbed reasonable share in third line, about 20%, and also, in both platinum sensitive and resistant second line, it has grabbed some market share. And again, that's only a few months after the approval. And remember, there's a pretty severe pandemic in between. Where, obviously the share is likely to grow even further because there's really not many options in this marketplace. So when we conduct our 2021 survey, we'll probably have a new number for the share of anatinib in this market. Then let's look at the PD-1 inhibitors. As I mentioned, Nivo and Pembro were the first one to enter. Now we are looking at the second relapse Hodgkin lymphoma market, which we call it a suddenly very crowded market. So we absolutely no approved drugs a few years ago, but now we have quite a few PD-1 inhibitors. So combined, Nivo and Pembro, when we did the survey, they had about 1/3 of market share. Sintilimab grabbed almost half of the share, but also, if you look at the key dates, we conducted the survey in January 2020, and remember that reimbursement only kicked in on January 1st, so that impact has not even fully incorporated in this market when we conduct the survey. And actually, a third local, domestic PD-1 inhibitor was approved right before we conducted the survey. So as you can imagine, when we conduct the 2021 survey, the share of the international brands are probably going to further shrink. So obviously, that's something, very different from what you see in U.S., Europe, or Japan. If you want to, if you play in the China market, obviously, there's a very, very different competitive landscape. So with that, I'm going to pass back to Mark so we can discuss the next topic.
Thank you, Song. I appreciate it. I just want to give the audience a chance to ask some questions. So if you do have questions, you can put your questions in the Q&A box on the side, and that will come through the portal. We have one more section left, and then we'll get to the Q&A section. That'll be a little bit more, but we're also coming up on 41 minutes into the session, so we're a little bit over today. So I do want to focus on standards of care in China, which is a really hot topic these days, and talk about the comparison of the G7 in terms of utilization rates. So for questions that, just an FYI, for questions that don't get answered, we'll be providing you guys with some follow-up communications on how to ask questions, how to get a copy of the presentation, how to get a copy of the recording will all be followed up with individually. So there's no need to request that information. I will make sure that everyone does receive that. So without further ado, let's hand it back to Linda and close out today's topic, which is standard of care in China versus the G7.
Yeah, thank you, Mark, and thank you guys for staying with us with the technical difficulty and so much data in it we want to share with you. So I appreciate that. So the last section, like Mark said, let's look at the overall standard of care of China and G7. We focused so much on drug, the drug utilization, targeted therapy, all those utilization differences, and we need to take one step back, look at the treatment modality. Here is the HCC, the treatment in the initial treatment of stage D in the Barcelona staging. This is probably the most advanced patients. And of course, you have earlier stage patients who are healthier and have very different treatment modality. But for today's purpose, we want to compare China versus G7. So we just figure out, pick one patient segment. Even for stage D patient, the most advanced patient, if you look across those four regions, US and EU are quite similar. In the more advanced metastatic patients, systemic therapy is the standard of care. But if you look at China and Japan, and there are more surgical-based therapy. Few years ago, TACE is a very China-Japan oriented technology, and you can see US and EU are also catching up in TACE-based therapy. And HCC, like we said several times, is a major tumor in China, a major tumor in global, but half of those are in China. So Chinese physicians have a lot of experience of treating HCC patients. So not only looking at the drug utilization, we also need to see the treatment differences. So after treatment differences, let's look into the drug once more for HCC. Here, the HCC patients treatment, the drug utilization is more based on the patient performance, Child-Pugh status. And again, same reason I picked only Child-Pugh C, the patient with most severe disease. Of course, CPA-B, they have their own pattern. But for today, let's look at Child-Pugh C. In US EU, sorafenib is the entrenched TKI with the newer lenvatinib also coming into play. China, sorafenib actually has been used very well. It's kind of the established standard of care. And with some lenvatinib utilization, but not as much as in Japan and US. Japan has a very special unique a unique drug, S1. In Japan and US. Japan has a very special unique drug, S1, used widely in Japan. And China, of course, also has some utilization of S1 too. But if you look at the majority part, and still many patients are being treated by the cytotoxic drug. And look at the US, there are huge others. And just I want to point out, within the others here, the immunotherapy drugs are the new targeted therapy drugs commonly utilized in the West are not available, are not utilized in China yet. If you look at the second and third line when patient refract and relapse, and in China, there are targeted therapy coming in, replacing the cytotoxic drugs, but still a lot of second, third line of Chinese patients are being treated by cytotoxic drugs. And U.S. HCC already being segmented significantly with targeted therapy, immunotherapy, all in place. And this in China will change too, because just recently, the China made camrelizumab and the Roche Tagl also recently approved in HCC. So next year we will see some shift towards the newer drug. But I'm aware of the time. So the last two slides is on Hodgkin's lymphoma, the hematology tumor. And if you look at the treatment modality, it's quite similar. And they both are treated across the country of systemic therapy plus with or without arching. And some of them followed by the stem cell transplant. So very similar, except that China, Japan has higher patients who choose not to be treated. So on the treatment side, looks similar, But if you look at the drug, and I'm not going to read through the whole list for the time's sake, and you can see in China throughout patients' progression, they all are being treated by cytotoxic drugs. While in Japan, EU, and US, the targeted therapy, immunotherapy, all come in play. But don't be masked by these top three drugs, because in China, like Sang showed in his slide, the immunotherapy are used, and especially some of the domestic made PD-L1 drugs. But just in the overall picture, the percentage is relatively small. So with that, I conclude the data side. Thank you so much for staying with us. Back to you, Mark.
Well, thank you, Linda, and thanks everyone for staying with us. As Linda said, obviously we have some technical difficulties, but this is the new ways that we work. We're currently over time today, but we will extend it for those who are interested to carry on our Q&A session. So if you have to drop off, feel free to do so. But we will carry on for the next couple of minutes here with being 12:19. So with that being said, I do have one question for the group, and that is, if you think about the future clinical developments in China, what targets or tumors or even technology do you think is going to be a focus for the China market, and why do you think that? So maybe we'll lead off with Song. Song, what are your thoughts first?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we actually use the tool called Cancer Landscape at Kantar. We did some scan because that tool allows us to do a clinical trial landscape scan. So we actually picked up the top tumors, in China that currently being studied in clinical trials. It's not surprisingly, if you look at the top tumors, those are either the big ones like breast cancer, non-small cell lung. Actually, non-small cell lung was on the top, and then the quote unquote China specific tumors that especially those GI tumors like gastric, esophageal, HCC that had not very high one show that burden slide, not very high in other countries, but quite high in China. A few other tumors that probably not on my previous slides. One is head and neck, particularly nasopharyngeal carcinoma, NPC. That is very unique tumor type in China, and especially in the southern part of China. You don't see NPC very often in other countries. You see, so there are quite a few head and neck clinical trials in China, and some blood tumors, probably based on CAR T, which I think Linda can probably provide more information based on the technology that we look for.
Yeah. So Linda, what's your thoughts there on technologies? Do you think that we're going to see some new novel technologies, or what are your thoughts?
Yes. I kind of wait to jump in. Yes, I think China has several areas which are actually leading the development, especially like cell therapy. If anybody in the audience probably went to the ASCO like we do annually, the CAR T based trials, cell-based trials in China, globally is increasing. And I think in the last few years, half of the trials are actually conducted in China. So I can see the trend is going that way. China will definitely having more CAR T based therapy to provide to the market. And the other part, like Sam mentioned, with those tumor with those molecules you can see a lot of them are in the PD-L1. Actually, PD-L1 based trial with China sponsored with Chinese sites actually the highest when we scan through all the targets. And of course other like VEGF1, VEGF2, and EGFR and HER2, all those are heavily being studied in China. And the other thing I also want to point out is 10 years ago when we were like focusing China so much. China is basically a generic country. A lot of the major pharmaceutical companies, they make huge profit on generics. Those are changing. If you look at the sponsors and of those trials, a lot of them actually have more trials than multinational companies in those new technology for oncology. Just to name a few, like the Jiangsu Hengrui is right on top of the list, and Tianqin, Zhengda Tianqin pharma groups, Beijing, like Sam mentioned, some of the really rising star of the Chinese companies are investing heavily in the oncology clinical trials and right to the novel agents, novel targets, novel technologies.
Interesting.
So they will come in play. Nicely. Yeah.
Yeah. So thinking about that, we've got a lot of different technologies going on. Song talked about, NPC as a unique tumor type. You're talking about the CAR Ts, but there seems to be a lot of interest from our audience talking about, getting more personalized with our therapeutics and our solutions. And I was curious if you guys had any opinions or insights on how biomarkers are driving, the focus on either tumor types or the technologies, and really what type of impact is the biomarker or biomarkers having in the China market. So maybe I'll go back to Song and get his opinion. Song, thoughts there?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's one thing we noticed that, when we review the treatment guidelines of individual tumors, we realized the guideline recommendations are quite different from what we saw in Japan, for example. Here in China, there are, the guidelines recommend NGS testing a lot, even for some of the biomarkers that there are no officially approved drugs on the China market yet. However, the treatment guidelines still recommend doing that test. Just get, for example, NTRK fusions. So that's I think it's a very strong preference apparently of the Chinese physicians to do biomarker testing and use that to guide the treatment options. Linda, what is your thought on it?
Yeah, I truly believe personalized medicine driven by biomarker will be the way to go, especially drugs are getting more expensive. And even with the immunotherapy, other targeted therapy, we know some people are not benefit from that. So I think that's the direction to go. And Kantar, we also have, the treatment architecture. A lot of you are familiar with. We do report all the treatment data, but for the last 2 years and also this year, we actually have been monitoring the NGS testing globally, including China. And very surprisingly, China, the biomarker testing actually is quite popular, like some of the guidelines already recommended. And the testing rate is actually on par with the Western world. But on the other hand, if you look at Japan and France, they have like national organized consortium on NGS testing. China testing is very like almost the mushroom. It's a lot of places they're doing the NGS testing. A lot of Chinese biotech companies doing that, and especially for some of the tumor we know have high biomarker driven segments like non-small cell and breast, those so the biomarker testing actually is quite prevalent. So I think in China, with the efficiency people work, the biomarker driven NGS testing will come in play to making the drug more efficient used to the right targeted population.
Interesting. So thank you. Yeah, it's definitely an evolving landscape. There's no doubt that there's a lot going on there, and personalized treatments are certainly the way of the future, not only in China but in the United States. We're now at 12:30 on the hour, which we're over on time. But I did want to let the audience know that for any of their questions that were not answered today, you can contact any of our experts here. So Anna Bordeaux, Linda Zhao, or Song Li. You can see their email addresses here on the screen, or certainly you can reach out to me. You will receive a notification, again, as I mentioned when we initiated this call, that will provide you with a recording of this session and certainly where to find the details for our previous episodes. So if you want to pass the link on to someone else, or you want to save it and rewatch it for yourself at a later date, you can certainly do that. But we certainly encourage you to ask our experts any questions. And we thank you for the opportunity to present to you today. We will likely have an episode 4 coming up in the month of December. So stay tuned, stay focused, and if you have any questions, again, please don't hesitate to reach out to us, and thank you for your participation.
Thank you.